Hello, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon, good morning, and a good evening, wherever you are joining us from. This is Dr. Sajid, your moderator for today's very important discussion on impact of COVID-19 on think tanks, with a key focus on in the global south. And this is a James McGann memorial session that we are having. And thank you so much for joining me. We are joined by Dr. Abid Suleri, Joint Executive Director, SDPI, for the welcome and opening remarks. For the keynote, we have Ibrahim M. Barki. He is Assistant Director, Middle East Center, University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, Dr. Barki, for joining us. We are also joined by Dr. Vaqar Ahmed, Joint Executive Director, SDPI from Pakistan. Thank you, Dr. Vaqar, for joining us. We are joined for a regional perspective on Dr. Samir Saran, is President, Observer Research Foundation, India. Thank you so much, Dr. Samir, for joining us. We have been following your work on a very influential Resina dialogue that you have been conducting in India, has been bringing very good debates. And from the Southern Voice, we are joined by Dr. Andrea. Dr. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us. She is the director of the Southern Voice, a think tank which is really kind of working regional and the global level work. I'm well aware of some of the recent initiatives on state of SDGs report, particularly focusing on impact of COVID-19 on inequality, and this is how think tanks has been contributing. And finally, I'm also joined by Enrique Mendizabal. I hope I pronounced it right. He is the founder and director on think tanks. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope I have covered all the names that I do have with me, and most probably I haven't missed. So to begin it formally, let me invite Dr. Abid Suleri for his opening and welcome remarks. Over to you.
Thank you, Sajid. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, depending from where you are logged in for this very important session, which we have attributed to our great friend, Dr. James McGann. Of course, he was a great promoter of think tanks, and his efforts and his contributions to bring some of the southern think tanks into mainstream discourse can never be forgotten. May God bless his South. The topic that we are discussing is about how think tanks in the global South got impacted by COVID-19. And I could see clearly there are two types of think tanks, depending upon the impact of COVID-19. There was one type of think tanks which, at least in Pakistan, which found that the fiscal space and the funders requirement were shrinking due to the smart lockdown, due to other financial constraints. They were forced to either lay out some of their team members, or they were forced to close down. Similarly, there were certain think tanks who found technological challenge. They were not able to adapt to online ways of doing business, online research. So this was one type of think tanks, and I think majority of small or medium think tanks, they fell in this category. Then there were other types of think tanks who found their work even demanding because governments all over the world, and especially in global South, they required some sort of evidence-based policy recommendations so they could do better. And that's where, again, it was a challenge for think tanks like SDPI. Now, SDPI, just to share with you that we never feel a problem of access. So most of the think tanks, they have problem of access to the policymakers. Now, SDPI serves on more than one advisory committees and advisory boards of Prime Minister. SDPI has very frequent meetings with the Prime Minister and other important members of cabinet. So for think tanks like us, there was more work, there was no money. And that was a challenge because, and especially among during COVID, there was time was very less for any robust research. So they required quick fix solutions. So what is it that I should do with small and medium entrepreneurs? And I need to do it by tomorrow. Tomorrow is cabinet meeting. Or how best to utilize the 1,200 billion rupees of COVID grant, which sector needs to be given priority, and the time is 1 hour. So of course, such demands, they put think tanks like SDPI in a very challenging situation. Any wrong advice or any miscalculated advice could have backfired very badly. And in order to do it in a timely manner was again a huge challenge. And then there's a third category of think tank that I can see during COVID-19. There was some think tanks which had a very specific sectoral focus. And then there were think tanks like SDPI who are multidisciplinary and who work on almost each and every aspect of social sector development. And I realized that if the think tanks, they were not focused on public health policy, other specific think tanks focusing on foreign affairs, focusing on just one aspect of economy, focusing on education, they found it difficult to remain relevant. While the think tanks which were multidisciplinary, which had transdisciplinary research programs, they were able to somehow reshape themselves. They were able to remain relevant. And going forward, I think the question of remaining relevance is what would keep on hunting us amidst shrinking fiscal space, amidst shrinking policy space, where most of the governments in the global south, they take any positive or negative criticism as a sign of betrayal. So of course there are certain liberty and certain circle of freedom within which think tanks have to operate. So remaining relevant there, I think it's a huge challenge. And with the galaxy of thought leaders from think tanks across the world, the question that we are looking to answer is that how we can remain relevant in the age of Omicron and in the age of many more variants that perhaps follow Omicron. So remaining relevant, producing robust research in a minimum time, quality research, robust research, but with a very short span of time, and meeting the policy appetite of policymakers. So these are some of the questions. And as a student of think tank community, I very much look forward to learn from all of the gurus who are present here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Suleri, for a very short yet a very comprehensive opening remarks, and bringing us the most pressing question that think tanks are facing, that is how we can remain relevant. And I think like its dual face that the pandemic has been having, it has brought some adverse impacts with the window of opportunities as well. And I think this is what applies to both to the think tanks as well. While it has been the kind of social issues that the COVID has pressed upon make the think tanks very relevant, but it has also challenged the think tanks for a very short term, very robust evidence bringing. And the think tanks which are mainly skilled for rapid assessments are facing real challenges in terms of bringing on how the very innovative evidence. So for this and more, let me invite for the today's keynote to Mr. Ibrahim M. Bakri. Over to you, sir, for your keynote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amin. And I do want to echo these sentiments that we heard in the keynote. I think that there are some very salient points that were raised about the role.
I think you have to unmute yourself, please.
I am not on mute, but I can get a little bit closer if that's better.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you. So just to restart, I do want to echo some of the notes that we heard in the
I'm
keynote.
sorry, I think you are still muted. You have to unmute yourself, please. Can we unmute from here?
We can hear him fine.
No, I'm not muted. Okay. Do you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear. Yeah.
I think it might just be an issue on their end,
Yeah.
but I'll continue. Yes, just once again, want to echo some of the sentiments that we heard in those introductory remarks. I think they were very well put about the challenges that think tanks face in turbulent times such as today. The rise of the Omicron virus, responding to COVID, the new responsibility and shift in the way that think tanks do research and the expectations that are put on think tanks right now. I think that was really well put. I do appreciate the invitation here today. I'm here representing the late Dr. James McGann, who was a firm just admirer and believer, not only in the role of think tanks internationally to respond to issues like this, but very much the role and potential that think tanks had in the global South to influence policy. I am a poor replacement for what he would have brought today, but I'm happy to kind of be able to step in and represent what he would have wanted to say. So today I actually do have some prepared remarks that he had prepared for this, that he had titled "A Bridge Over Troubled Waters and Turbulent Times." And this is really just kind of a framework to kind of think about this conversation that we're having. Although it's not explicitly COVID or Omicron specific, I do think that it lays a fantastic foundation for the conversations that'll be had later on that I wish that I'd be able to join you for. So he begins. So what is a think tank? And this is in Dr. McGann's voice. I always begin my discussion of think tanks with a definition to help clarify what we're talking about. I welcome your comments and reactions to my speech and this definition of think tanks. Think tanks are public policy, research, analysis, and engagement organizations that generate policy-oriented research, analysis, and advice on domestic and international issues, thereby enabling policymakers and the public to make informed decisions about public policy. Think tanks may be affiliated or independent institutions that are structured as permanent bodies, but not ad hoc commissions. These institutions often act as a bridge between the academic and policymaking communities and between states and civil society, serving the public interest as independent voices that translate applied and basic research into a language that's understandable, reliable, and accessible for policymakers and the public. Beginning in the 1970s, public policy research institutions experienced explosive growth. Today, there are over 14,500 think tanks worldwide, with representation in virtually every country. The boom was driven and defined by globalization, the growth of civil society, and new demands for timely and concise analysis. In recent years, however, the surge has died down and the pace of think tank establishment has slowed. Today, think tanks face extinction unless they learn to innovate and adapt to a rapidly changing political economy in which they operate. While many factors have contributed to the decline in the establishment of think tanks, a shortage of money and the growth of an information-rich environment are arguably the most influential. Limited private and public funding for think tanks has resulted in short-term, project-specific funding rather than long-term institutional support. Think tanks also face competition from advocacy organizations, for-profit consulting groups, law firms, and electronic media for the attention of busy policymakers and an increasingly distracted public. In today's environment, anyone can be a think tank, at least virtually. The world is witnessing a rise of populism, nationalism, nativism, and protectivism, signaling a challenge to the post-World War II order and multilateralism. At the same time, transnational challenges such as growing trade tensions, economic turbulence, and increasing economic inequality, climate change, mass migration, refugee crises, as well as traditional and non-traditional security threats, including COVID, demand that countries and institutions cooperate more regularly and effectively. We're facing a significant period of change where established international organizations that have helped sustain the relative peace and prosperity for the last 70 years are under assault. This is all taking place while an enduring and emerging existential transnational threat is growing. The post-World War II economic, political, and security order is being challenged and redefined by national and regional tectonic shifts in domestic and international politics. We're living through an extraordinary moment in world history, and it's important to take stock of the technological, political, economic, and organizational trends and disruptions that are taking place in real time. These are daunting challenges, and so it's essential that we take the time to assess these cross-cutting issues and trends and their impact on society and politics. It's also critical that we marshal our intellectual and institutional resources in order to understand and effectively respond to these new and unprecedented chain of events. There are 4 key trends that flow from the 4th Industrial Revolution that will transform all of our jobs and lives over the next 10 years. It's these forces that are driving the digital and political disruptions that sweep across the globe. In order: the disruptive power of social media, artificial intelligence, and big data, the dramatic increase in the rate of technological change, the rise of global information interdependency, and the increased velocity of information and policy flows. The internet, human and digital networks that are constantly being enhanced by new technologies are increasing both the volume and velocity of information flows around the world. These new realities are making it possible to manage and manipulate massive amounts of data, which is disrupting business, politics, and public policy. Henry Kissinger famously said that being a policymaker is like being at the end of a fire hose, and today we are at the end of that fire hose. These trends in information and technology have served as an accelerant that's fueling the political discontent and disruptions that are on the rise in the US, Lebanon, France, Britain, Italy, Philippines, Hungary, and other countries around the world. Some have erroneously attributed the source of this discontent to a backlash against globalization. The reality is much more complex and involves a number of issues and problems that, thanks to the internet, social media, and social networks, have become omnipresent and inescapable. The uncertainty of our times has created a sea of insecurity that has made people concerned and confused about their future, their work, and their well-being. The sea of insecurity is comprised of 5 factors that have intensified over the past 5 to 7 years. Economic insecurity in jobs, with entire careers and professions being re-engineered or simply vanishing, and a growing income gap and opportunities for the current generation. Physical insecurity, as we're reminded on a daily, hourly basis of attacks, the impact of climate change and other catastrophic events, such as the prospects of nuclear conflict, all of which increase our sense of insecurity, loss of national and personal identity, challenging demographic patterns, and regular and irregular migration. The New World Disorder, or the balance of power that was characteristic after the Cold War, which provided a degree of order and insecurity, which is missing today. And history says that the most unstable and dangerous periods of time are the ones where there are multiple power poles and powers that are rising and falling. We're in such a period where everyone is in charge and no one is in charge. Information insecurity. The information age has given us unprecedented access and convenience, but this comes at the cost of privacy, security, loss of identity, and to a certain extent, humanity. This flood of information, which includes disinformation, misinformation, and attempts to manipulate us, make us feel uncertain and insecure. Sea change and security, or the world is undergoing a revolutionary change in science, technology, and society. The prospect of no clear answers, which is the most unsettling aspect, that's that our leaders and institutions are not focusing on key issues. They're not addressing concerns of why there's been a loss of trust and confidence in government and elected officials. The failure of government or elected officials to address these issues is because of political polarization, political fragmentation, and policy paralysis, which has left citizens disillusioned and discontent. These factors may help explain why people are gravitating towards non-traditional politicians who promise security and quick fixes to complex issues. This is where think tanks can play a critical role by helping create the answers and action that's needed in countries today. Think tanks play a critical role in analyzing, developing, and promoting policy solutions, particularly in times of extreme disruption and change. However, these organizations now operate in information-rich societies where facts, evidence, and credible research are often ignored, and where disinformation can gain a footing. To remain relevant and impactful, think tanks and public policy institutes must simultaneously pursue rigor, innovation, accessibility, and accountability more than ever before. In short, think tanks must adapt and innovate by transforming their organization to be smarter, faster, better, and more mobile. While these are challenging times, it's also a time of opportunity for institutions that can develop new and innovative solutions to complex issues. Policymakers still require reliable, accessible, and useful information on the mechanics of current policies and on the costs and consequences of policy alternatives. These needs have long been central to government decision-making, but now more than ever, the forces of globalization require analytical insight to bridge the gap between research and actually implementing policy solutions. A few recommendations on what think tanks can do to fill this need and bridge the gap are the following. First, research must be timely and accessible in order to effectively engage policymakers, the media, and the public. Gone are the days when a think tank could operate with the motto, research it, write it, and they'll find it, publishing a white paper and assuming that an influential policymaker would come and access it eventually. To have meaningful effect, think tanks must place relevant analysis in the right hands, in the right format, at the right times. This means strategic use of Facebook, LinkedIn, infographics, and video briefs to communicate information and analysis on key policy issues. Policymakers read an average of 30 minutes a day, and they're not reading books or journals. A think tank's objective should be to capture their attention so they direct their staff to read the 300-page book or report. Second, think tanks must adapt to the growing demand for rapid data and analysis. Our era of constant connectivity brings with it a perpetual flood of information, from television to the blogosphere, from political advocacy to social media campaigns. Think tanks must be nimble enough to adjust to the acceleration and information avalanches that technical change will bring about. To preserve their future, think tanks will need to adopt entrepreneurial and tech-savvy communication strategies while continuing to produce rigorous, policy-relevant analysis. Think tanks must be fit for an uncertain future and must modernize and become engines, innovations, by proposing breakthrough policies akin to the innovations introduced by science, technology, and medicine. In an information-rich, highly competitive marketplace of ideas and policy advice, think tanks must demonstrate why they matter and how they can make a difference in the lives of people in the countries they're located. Those are the end of the remarks that he had prepared today. I do appreciate the opportunity to come and speak and give these remarks on his behalf. And I'm certain that the rest of this conversation is going to be extremely insightful. Once again, wish that I was able to join you for it, but I really do appreciate the focus on memorializing Dr. McGann, his influence, his belief, and his faith in the role of think tanks in the future and in writing the course of history is something that I think will never be forgotten. And summits like this and conversations like this are part of the legacy he left behind. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and I wish you the best for the rest of this conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Bakri. I hope and trust that your keynote will be setting the context for the discussion that we will be following on. And if I can take 3 key messages from your discussion or the keynote, the one is that think tanks has now to be more proactive in a very specific recommendations and policy solutions instead of giving the broad-based. And there needs to be more innovative, accessible, and accountable in terms of thinking, in being innovation and reaching to the policymakers. The most importantly, it was that we are living in very uncertain times, and the times before COVID-19 will not be similar to the time after COVID-19 for the think tanks, and it has catalyzed the technological, economic, and other disruptions. One of the key factors, I think, the impact is differentiated across the region. It's varying country to country, region to region, and even by the speciality of these think tanks. The think tanks who are more working on the social issues like social protection, food security, hunger, they stood more relevant in the very initial wave. And so to have a different perspective, how it has been the differentiated impact across the region and the countries. Let me now invite Dr. Vaqar Ahmed from the Pakistan to share his thoughts on how SDPI has experienced this and how overall Pakistani perspective on the impact of COVID-19 on think tanks. Over to you, Dr. Vaqar.
Thank you, Dr. Sajid, for giving me the opportunity, and thank you, Ibrahim, for the keynote. I think I join you and Dr. Suleri and others really in missing James here. He was supposed to be with us for this session, and it's really sad that we have to do this without him. But as you rightly said, and as Dr. Suleri rightly said, that the mission and the cause should continue. I'll remain brief because I'm really looking forward to listening from Samir, Andrea, and Enrique. But just to add on to what both presentations have informed us up until now, I think there are 2 or 3 things at hand. One is that from a think tank perspective, COVID has brought back some demand for evidence and data, given that civil service, governments, they were all sort of grappling for more information, at least in the first and second waves of the COVID. And they were really at pains to really find out that whose evidence mattered and whose evidence was credible. And policymakers were really asking for real-time evidence. I think they would continue to do so amid future expected waves of a pandemic as well. And I think this, from a think tank lens, this now gives us a window to encourage some specific interventions in evidence use and uptake at the government level. Second, I think one of the areas where think tanks did aim to help government capacity was with regards to targeting efficiency when it came to giving handouts or cash handouts or in-kind handouts to the poorest of the poor communities. And governments, of course, in our part of the world didn't have perfect information with regards to, for example, in areas which were laggard or far-flung areas where targeting efficiency really mattered. And that's where think tanks really partnered with the government to improve targeting efficiency. I think one of the things which we now understand is that going forward in any national disaster, governments can't do it alone. That was the biggest realization, of course, even at the state level. And that's probably where I think we have to be more sort of innovative, out of box in how sort of we reach out to the governments in future, even if that is at a pilot level. But that's where academia and local think tanks can really help. Now, there were certain areas which require just food for thought going forward. And I just touch upon three. One is that academia or think tanks, the wider communities, often termed as slow to respond to government's request. But in the case of Pakistan, I found that the most immediate impact of COVID was in fact provided by the three think tanks and not the usual consultant fraternity which is around in Islamabad. And I think that was very heartening to see that it was local academia which had come up with the estimates for COVID loss. But that was probably just the starting point. And the government then wanted solutions, clear pathways out of the problem being faced, or how to sort of address that COVID-related loss. And that is where I think donor think tank partnership helped the government. And that is, there are going to be several models, but I think one of them that we presented was a food security dashboard for the Prime Minister, with access to the chief ministers as well, which can help smooth out the food price inflation, or at least monitor it in a better manner. The second, of course, was that policymakers were now more accessible to think tanks and academia, and they were really banking on local experts, given that they knew that commissioning consultants would take a much more longer time. It was local think tanks who stood by them. And one of the examples in this case would be in the trade space, where, for example, we partnered with the Ministry of Commerce, and we were asked to set up a grievance redressal mechanism, a chat pod wherein those who were facing supply chain disruptions could really log in and inform the Secretary of Commerce and his team about where their consignments were getting stuck. And probably if those issues were to be taken at a diplomatic level, that could happen. I think the approach to public-private dialogue, PPDs, also evolved. And that's where think tanks also played a very important role. A planning commission think tank partnership resulted in a series of 13 focus groups, which planning commission led, and the think tank here provided support in headhunting the most appropriate respondents across the country and beyond. And today, this structure of PPD is now practiced by the central bank amid the current and the future expected waves of the pandemic. But this also became a model for other future disasters which could take place, you know. But just to sort of summarize this and just to close this, you know, I think despite of think tank capabilities available to the government, inclusion and leave no one behind considerations were weakly met. For example, which think tanks represent the second-tier cities or the third-tier cities of Pakistan? And did we have universities from these regions which were connected with Islamabad? I don't know of any such examples, if there were one.
The second disconnect is, as in his opening remarks, Dr. Abid also said, more transdisciplinary capabilities were required to put forward, build back better proposals. In most of the think tanks, I can tell you in Pakistan, we struggled to put health and economy teams together. We hadn't had an opportunity to work together in the past, and we didn't know how economic systems and health systems could simultaneously be modeled. And this is where I think the transdisciplinary capabilities gap has to be addressed. The third and final disconnect was that the government's own procurement systems didn't allow commissioning rapid research. And this is at the heart of weak linkages between policymakers and Southern academia. And even ministries and divisions which had budget lines to commission research couldn't hire services on a war footing. And while at a macro level, this problem is often talked about, but local administrators, local governments who wish to hire local academia can't just do it because of the rigidities in the procurement system, which one needs to address. So I just close over here. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Vaqar. Bringing perspective from Pakistan and SDPI, and three very important points coming that the first impact of COVID-19 that think tanks move more towards a solution-based responses like the food security dashboard that you refer to, and most importantly, one of the key impact was that policymakers were more available now, and they were more willing to work with the think tanks. And I think this was one of the positive impacts as the COVID-19 catalyzed the social issues, and think tanks became on the first point of response given their skills in the rapid assessments compared to the academia. So I think this was one reason that brought. And finally, it's more prevalence, the post-COVID prevalence of the public-private dialogue, which definitely promotes participatory public policy making. On the challenges that you highlighted, I think they're very fundamental challenges, and maybe not only the think tanks. For example, one of the key challenge that kind of interconnecting health and economy teams. And this was a difficult task for the think tanks by the nature, actually. Even if you see all the macro models before the pre-COVID, health was not a major ingredient in all the economy models. It was taken as a residual sort of. This was actually the COVID-19 who made us realize that health is an economic issue. Actually, it is a macro prudent risk. The health has emerged. So very rightly mentioned, and finally also on the government procurement, delaying the commissioning of research, and we understand that given all those rigidities that you have been highlighting, we will be improving over the time. But let me now hear from India that how things has been happening in India. From the Dr. Samir, and also linking these to the broader regional level, one of the key opportunities that has COVID-19 has brought is the collaboration. We have an example of scientific collaboration across the globe, which actually really helped fast pacing the vaccination preparations. And then, is there any lesson for think tanks community, and how is South Asia prepared for that opportunity? Over to you, Dr. Samir. Thank you.
Thank you to the chair, Dr. Sajid, and a very warm hello to my dear friend Vaqar, who I last saw in India when he was doing a leadership fellowship at the Observer Research Foundation. And it's really been fascinating to see your journey, Vaqar, and the work of SDPI over the years, and more power to you and for the work you do. And thank you for inviting me at this forum. I think it's important to reflect on what has certainly been the most turbulent 2 years in my life, in my memory. But I'm sure many would agree with me that this pandemic was perhaps dramatically different to any other shocks that we have experienced previously, be it the financial crisis or the conflicts that we have seen. I think the last 18 months were life-shaping. Perhaps even so expansive in their impact that we still don't fully visualize the tail they will leave behind, the pandemic will leave behind. We are still to fully assess the implications of what we are going through today. I want to take this opportunity to first celebrate James McGann. I think someone like him, who was a force of nature, full of energy, determined to build a community that would serve countries, communities, and nations, and indeed the international institutions and the firmaments, needs to be celebrated. I think it would be perfectly apt to see the progress of think tanks in the days ahead as a result of James' efforts in the previous decades. Words elude me because we were in the middle of a new project, and I hope we can take it forward. But I believe that his seminal contribution in the past years was to bring all of us together. Let me give you an example. In the last 18 months or so, ORF, where I work, we have published approximately 2,000 short pieces and maybe 200 research papers contributed by experts from 60 different countries. And I'm talking about the pandemic period, where we were only linked through the digital. And this very large community that we could tap into and get responses from, get evidence-based research from, get experiences from, was possible because of people like Jim. People who built up this community, connected us all, made us feel part of the same group, living separately but working towards a common purpose. And we benefited as institutions because of this community, and we could dip into them. So I think James' impact on all of us is also something that we will only begin to appreciate in the days ahead. And it would be only fair to continue to honor him in many of these events, functions, and platforms that he helped shape and put vital energy into. So James, travel well and rest in peace, my friend. On the role of think tanks, let me first endorse everything I've heard this morning. I think it's been fantastic presentations. Of course, the speech by Jim was comprehensive, and the points Vaqar made are on the ball. I think for me, I want to just share in addition 3 ideas. The first idea I want to share is that, as Vaqar mentioned in his intervention, we have to internalize our core reason of existence as a think tank, which is we are the defenders of research. We are the defenders of evidence-based research. We are the defenders of the long form. We are not Twitter personalities. We are not here to give flashy op-eds and sensational headlines. The think tanks must realize that we are where real work to produce evidence-based knowledge, to produce knowledge that will shape the future, that will help the present, and that will understand the past is produced. And I think if we understand that and we embrace it, then we can start thinking about how to present it. So when we say make research accessible, it does not mean dilute research. It means that once you have conducted research, how do we communicate research? And I think that is the difference between a think tank and a media house and a digital publication or even a financial system advisory firm. So I think the first is we are here to defend long-form research, and the pandemic has made us acutely aware of the dearth of this kind of research. In fact, all of us were, like Vaqar was alluding, many of us were turned to by various actors because they believed in the sanctity of what we produced. And to retain that kind of reputation and trust, we must continue to invest in the art of research. And I think that is what requires the single largest attention going forward. We must see it as an art form. We must invest in fine-tuning, shaping, and producing more credible outputs in our institutions. The pandemic underscored the need for credibility of knowledge. And I think we must take it upon ourselves to become those credible producers of knowledge in this age. And I think that's the first challenge for us, opportunity for us, but also a reaffirmation of our purpose for us. And I think that's my first point I wanted to communicate. The second, of course, is that we have to move away from the obsession of seeing governments and policymakers as our marketplace. We have to get over it. Policy is no longer made by the traditional bureaucrats, elected representatives, and lawmakers. Policies are now increasingly made on the streets of our cities. Influencers shake the establishment and produce desired outcomes. We have seen it happening in your country. We have seen it happening in my country. We have seen it happening in the US. We have seen it happening everywhere. There are influencers who need to be reached out to as well. I always tell folks that Greta Thunberg has more impact on climate debate than Brookings Institution ever will have, while Brookings has far greater understanding of the climate debate than Greta Thunberg will ever have. Now, if Brookings and Greta could work together, we might have an influencer and sensible policy suggestions coming out together. So it is also incumbent upon people like us to reach the new age influencers who have more impact on policy than traditional policymakers. And I think the partnership between think tanks now must extend to those beyond government. Let's get over this government fetish. I think that is the second lesson from the pandemic, because guess what? When the ferocity of the pandemic was upon us, governments were missing. It was communities who were responding to the pandemic. We must start pricing communities higher. In our own estimation, we must see community leaders, influencers, social change agents as important as governments are. And I think that's the second lesson from the pandemic. Think tanks now need to reach those who are best placed to make change. And those are not necessarily elected representatives or career bureaucrats. We have to go to the streets and we have to start talking to those who have voices that matter. And I think that's the second change that we need to address and inculcate in us. The third idea is that we can do none of this unless we look after ourselves. We have all realized, first of all, when Dr. Sajid said, view from India, there is no view from India. Last 2 years, we are all sitting on Zoom. There is no country that you and I reside in. We are all interacting through Zooms and digitals and in the virtual medium. We have only one city. It's called Planet iPad, Planet Apple, Planet PC, Planet whichever brand you use. That is our country these days. We are all the same. We are basically riding on the single most important ingredient, which is human capital. If think tanks have to progress, we have to invest in our own human capital. We are not either going to be the second choice of those who could not get into consulting firms, or those who could not get into the bureaucratic services, or those who cannot, or those who are waiting to enter politics. We must be the first choice of the best minds in the world who want to change public policy. We have to rethink our human capital design. We have to start thinking about salaries. We have to start thinking about career growth. We have to start thinking about progression, and we have to start thinking about self-actualization. We were very comfortable with the concept of building numbers rather than building capabilities. And I think going ahead, think tanks must invest in human resources, human capital. During the pandemic, the think tanks were not immune to the virus or its implications. I sadly lost a couple of colleagues to the pandemic in the last 2 years. And I realized that the single most important task for me was to keep our team healthy, not only safe from the virus, but also from working at home, sharing a room with a large number of family members and trying to work from there. Mental health issues, emotional issues, questions around motivation levels, ensuring that everyone had the energy to wade through the waters we were confronted with, the turbulent waters we were swimming through. And I think we had to learned very quickly over the last 18 months that we needed to look after ourselves. Unless we were all sane, sensible, protected, and in a good space, we would not be productive and would not be capable of sharing ideas and solutions with others. So I think we also have to invest in ourselves. It is not only about building the connections outside. It is better to also build deep connections within. And I always tell people, it doesn't matter if someone moves from ORF to SDPI to Brookings to Carnegie, wherever they want to move. Once we are part of the same community, we remain connected. We are contributing to a common purpose, and irrespective of the institutional affiliation, we are still a team think tank. And I think we'll start thinking about think tanks and human resources as a cohort that lives together. And therefore, one of the ideas that I want to leave behind is that networks in think tanks matter. We were able to mobilize the publications from 60 countries because we never saw them as being different from those who reside in our buildings in New Delhi or Bombay or Calcutta or DC. So I think Jim's mission in life was to build a think tank network community. I think we must carry that forward and create these new age networks where we can tap into expertise from any other institution in the world if we need a quick response to a situation that is developing in our part of the world. And having the ability to access each other's very special talent is something that we must invest into and in fact promote and take forward. As I conclude, let me just reflect on a couple of issues that need urgent attention. I think in South Asia, for example, we have seen the huge potential of technology, of lifting people, of connecting people, of giving them voice, of giving them employment, changing their way of lives. Alongside this revolution, this digital revolution, we have also seen equally dark disruptions. The digital age beckons greater social science research. Its implications for our social contracts, its implications for our society, its implications for democracy, its implications for peaceful coexistence. All of these assumptions of the 20th century can be discarded and new ones need to be discovered. The golden age of innovation must be accompanied by golden age of social sciences. It has always been the case. You cannot have scientific progress without deep investments into social sciences and liberal studies. And I think that is one area where think tanks need to start focusing a lot of attention on. The social implications of many innovations that are transforming the world. And I think South Asia is going to be in many ways the frontier of that. We are a region which is going to leapfrog a few decades in a very short time. And therefore, we must invest in understanding the wider implications of this leapfrogging. We should not celebrate leapfrogging without studying it with great intensity. And that's something South Asia needs to do. And second, of course, we must realize that we are the first region in the world, and maybe not the first, but maybe we are amongst the first few regions of the world that is going to become middle class in its income levels in the green age. We are not going to have the luxury of burning carbon the way Europe and Americas did. We are going to have to do it through a frugal economic model that prices carbon and ensures that carbon remains buried under the ground. Now, we are going to be the green destinations, the green geographies of the 2030s. In the next decade, many of us would have become mid-income countries. Many of us would have actually made the transitions in a very different world. We would have created a new green print of future development for others to emulate. We must study and chronicle our journeys more intensely. We must collaborate across borders in this region, and we must create a South Asian green model that others can embrace. And I think that could be another opportunity for all of us. Thank you. I have taken too much time, but let me again thank you for the work he has done, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Samir. You haven't taken too much time. It was worth taking, even if you have taken. And let me we join you in celebrating James and his work, and we really see, and we agree that his work will be celebrated in the times to come, the way he has been doing the work. Some very interesting and discussion and points from you, but one point that I'll pick on to invite my next speaker, Dr. Andrea, and that is the think tanks networks matter. No matter we are going for the long form research, that actually the pandemic has challenged, or we are sort of investing in the human capital. The collaboration in the age of digitalization will be very critical. And I think who is more kind of the best person to respond on this? How can think tank networks can be improved from the Dr. Andrea, who has been working from the Southern Wise, connecting think tanks across the regions. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Sajid, and good afternoon to everybody who has joined the session. As Sajid mentioned, I'm with Southern Voice, a network of almost 60 think tanks across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with the objective of positioning the research generated in this region in the global debates. And I think it's been a very interesting discussion so far. In response to Sajid's comment, and also to Abid's request at the beginning, who said, how do we stay relevant? I would like to focus some of my comments now on how think tanks can relate to these global discussions, and particularly think tanks from the Global South. So indeed, networks are an important aspect of the work of think tanks. Being able, as Samir said, to tap into the knowledge, into formal and informal networks that think tanks have across the globe is part of the value added also that the think tank brings to policymakers and to other actors working in this space. So there's no doubt of the importance of these networks. What is important, though, in this context is also to acknowledge that within these networks and within the think tank community, there are these power dimensions, and that we have larger players. We have much more well-positioned think tanks in the global north, particularly, who have taken forward some of these global discussions. But it's also important that the voices and the perspectives from the Global South are heard in these spaces. So I think that that's why the think tanks should think about what are the mechanisms to start working in some of the discussions that are occurring at the global level. So, for example, we have within our network think tanks in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh who are very active on discussing the issue of the impact of COVID-19 on the garment industry, and did a very interesting job of connecting what was happening at the national level in these two countries, the impact that the slowdown of the fast fashion industry was having on employment and on the lives of the workers in this value chain, and to bring this discussion into a debate that also included companies and the buyers of garments that are these large scale companies. So this is just one example of how think tanks can become more global and bring their thinking at the global level, and how it's important to work in this network approach, because by bringing together cases from beyond one country, these think tanks were well positioned to say, this is not only the case of some few companies in one small country. We're talking about a larger problem that needs attention both at the national level and at the global level. And I think that moving forward and to keep the relevance, think tanks must definitely keep moving in the direction of responding to the most important global issues. And I'm glad to hear the reflection and the self-analysis that Vaqar did about the difficulties of joining economic and health analysis that the team faced at the beginning of the pandemic. And we saw something similar happening across the think tanks in Southern Voice. We saw that there were some difficulties on discussing some of the key issues that were relevant in the pandemic. For example, vaccines. We know that think tanks in the global north were discussing the issue of vaccines very early on in the pandemic, which positioned them to understand the debate, to be able to follow what was the discussion. I think here, think tanks from the global south were a bit of usually latecomers into the debates. And now we see how critical it really is, the issue of vaccines, and how this is something that cannot be solved only by one country, or that the advice cannot come only from one think tank. So this is one of those other cases where we see first the importance of the global discussions for the national policies and the role that think tanks can have in them. And we also see the importance of bringing these discussions at the global level to the national level, that we should have been discussing the issues of vaccine maybe much more sooner in some of our countries than we were doing. And another issue that I think is really relevant, that would benefit from the thinking from think tanks across the global south, has to do with the global monetary response. So the whole discussion about what the IMF is doing with the special drawing rights, the SDRs, is something that we see very driven by the discussion of think tanks in the global north. And I think here it's yet another one of those topics where they are global in nature. They are, they are having a critical impact on the capacity to respond of particular countries. So it's very important to keep an eye on them. So these are just a couple of examples about how networks can enable think tanks to think of issues that are of global nature. I think these are opportunities for think tanks to exercise their leadership in some of the most critical global issues. Another final point that I would like to make that is not particularly related to the issue of networks, but I think it talks well to the discussion we've been having so far, and the issue of relevance is a reflection that I heard from one colleague from a think tank in our network. And it's that maybe because of the pandemic, we've gained this illusion that the democratic discourse is more open, and that there are more opportunities of influence, because think tanks have been in some cases particularly well positioned to reach policymakers. But we have to be careful with this illusion of being close to policymakers, and that this is just happening for a small group of experts, and that it might not be really responding to making the discussions much more democratic. And I think that goes again well to Vaqar's point of leave no one behind, in the sense that, are we making sure that in these discussions it's not only some well-positioned think tanks that are driving the discussions, but how are we leveraging knowledge that is distributed in many other places in outside the capital cities or outside the global hubs. And with that, I'll finish my intervention.
Thank you, Dr. Andrea, for giving us a perspective from the Southern Voice perspective on if I can summarize even all the discussions that have been done so far, I think one common point that is coming is that remaining relevance is becoming a challenge because initially think tanks have to be remain level, most probably on the local level mostly, but now you have to remain relevant at the regional and the global level issues. The issues like health and other disruptions are the global level issues, and there are some enablers as well. For example, the possibilities of networking are more now. Possibilities of reaching to the global community are more now. Technology, digitalization is providing those opportunities. So all this can lead to think that the think tanks in the future will be different from the think tanks before the COVID-19. There are very structural, fundamental shifts going to happen in terms of thinking, research agenda, communication, operations of think tanks. To listen more on the future of think tanks, let me invite Mr. Enrique for his thoughts. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I have been meaning to go to this SDC festival for many years now, and now I can through Zoom. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed all the interventions and keynote, and so I will focus my attention on the future of think tanks. And I will go back to something Dr. Saran said. And I sort of agree on. I agree particularly on the fact that think tanks need to pay attention to other audiences than the ones they have been used to paying attention to. But I think this has far-reaching effects into the organizations. And let me try to explain this. I think the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic, of course, have had short-term effects on think tanks. We've mentioned the effect it has had on staff, the effect it has had on the way think tanks are engaging with technology. It has had a direct effect on think tanks' efforts to connect to other think tanks locally, regionally, and globally. It has had an effect on, at the short term at the very least, on demand for evidence from governments. And in some cases, it has had negative, some of these are negative effects, not just positive effects. And in some cases, it has created, changes in the context in which think tanks operate. And there are many organizations that we work with that report much more, governments closing down on the civic space, a relationship that is becoming a lot more antagonistic and even dangerous for some organizations and for their staff. So many sudden changes on think tanks, certainly in 2020 and some part of 2021. I think to some extent things are calming down a little bit now. Funders are, especially international funders, are reallocating their budgets. We see increases in funding for many think tanks around the world. We've seen also anecdotally, but we do talk to think tankers everywhere. We see a lot more interest by local philanthropists or business associations in supporting or even creating think tanks. We're working on projects in Egypt and in Peru, for instance, and in Venezuela, where new think tanks are being set up by local businesses and by local philanthropists. Something that was not common discussion a couple of years ago, certainly before the pandemic. We also see something that I think is a great trend, which is much more global open space. Think tanks hiring globally, think tanks communicating globally, not just to their local audiences. So a lot of changes in the short term, in the medium term. But all of this suggests think tanks are more or less working the way they were working before, but with some adjustments. Now, I think that if we look much further into the future, we will see some bigger changes. And the reason why I say this is because we're seeing some signs of those changes right now. So we see an increased role, or a much more influential role, of these other actors, right? The influencers, but not the celebrity influencers. But I think most places we see individuals who have become sort of policy influencers by being experts in a particular area and by being great at communicating that expertise, through social media and in a language and a style that is much more accessible than what most think tanks have been good at. They're very good at what's Dr. Samir called sort of long form research and communicating, technically sound advice, but not necessarily have been good at engaging with community leaders, social movements, just regular people that are now being bombarded by information, by sort of an extreme polarization of ideas. They are in desperate need for clarity about what's going on around them. And they are looking for this information, and they're not necessarily getting it from the traditional think tanks. They're getting it from other sources, whether it's that individual social movement, activist, or even from the media. I was talking to somebody who's sort of former director of communications at Brookings, who's saying that these large think tanks were now competing with the likes of Netflix. A documentary can help explain what Brookings can do, can try to explain in years and years and years, but actually a single documentary can shed light on a complex problem for most people. I also think that think tanks are going to want to engage with these audiences, these different actors. They're going to have to rethink the way they do research. And this is not to suggest that they're going to dumb down their work, but they're going to have to think about the usual approach to undertaking research, the sort of scientific academic style of going away, literature reviews, some data collection, some analysis, sort of disconnected from these activists and social movements and influencers. I don't think that's going to work for many in the future. And activists, social movements, influencers, they're going to want to be part of these research processes. And this is going to have an impact on the way that that think tanks organize themselves and organize their research teams. They are also going to expect that think tanks are much more representative of the people that they are engaging with, or they're speaking about or speaking for. And I think we see demand for this around the world, right? In the North-South, the global North, global South relationship, we see sort of demand for, more global South voices and faces in panels or debates about the global South, right? I don't think it's acceptable anymore to have a seminar on Pakistani politics in the UK without Pakistanis, or South Asia without South Asians involved. It doesn't matter that the researchers have PhDs or postdocs in those regions or countries. It just doesn't look good anymore, and people do not accept it. And I think the same thing will apply at the local level. Think tanks have been, not necessarily by design, but by the nature of their work, have been quite elitist organizations, right? Selecting the best from the best universities. Inevitably, that means that they're mostly middle class, upper middle class organizations from a certain background, people who come, who see the world in a certain way. And I think if they want to be much more relatable to these new audiences, they're going to have to learn to hire individuals from different backgrounds, who have different skills, who have different experiences in life. And this is going to challenge their business models for sure. So the context is changing, and this is going to have effects on think tanks. And I think individuals within the think tanks are going to be changing, and this is going to have an effect on them. And I share an article in the chat with those interested. But if I was to think way into the future, I would suggest that at least two things are going to happen to think tanks. The first one, as I said, is I think there will be a lot more diversity. There will still be some large think tanks which will have to change. That's fine. You know, big money tends to follow big money. So if there's an organization that is very well funded, other funders will continue to fund those. But I also think that there will be a lot more options, a lot more different business models around, and there will be a lot more smaller think tanks or think tanks at a very local level, or think tanks specializing on specific issues. And within think tanks, I believe that those who survive are going to have to be much more diverse. You know, not just, you know, talk the talk of diversity, they're going to have to walk the walk of diversity. And this will have implications on, you know, for example, you know, what they consider to be robust evidence. You know, what are the different approaches to knowing and to learning that think tanks accept and incorporate? How many think tanks do you know, would find it very easy to sit down an eminent academic next to an indigenous activist or indigenous leader, you know, and have a conversation about evidence? You know, they would probably struggle to have to moderate that discussion, but they will have to learn how to do that. And the second big change that I think we'll probably see is the space, is the bricks and mortars. You know, are we going to continue to see think tanks, you know, in sort of institution housed within, you know, buildings and structures or clear boundaries? Or are we going to see many more kind of pop-up think tanks, sort of coffee house think tanks, which is sort of the origin of the RSA, the Royal Society of Arts, which is the longest living think tank in existence. Are we going to see more of these spaces that are much more which have unclear boundaries, much more flexible, much more open, where researchers come and go, communicators come and go, where they might have, you know, a gig here, you know, with one think tank and another one with another think tank? Are we going to see also think tanks that are completely decentralized? We're having Andrea Ordóñez's initiative Southern Voice and on think tanks organized a youth think tankers forum, a young think tankers forum for the Southern Voice conference last month. And I think one of the things that came up is that maybe think tanks will be able to host their staff around the country, you know, at the local level, local universities, local libraries, local coffee shop. It doesn't matter. You don't need to have them all in the capital city or in the, you know, capital cities of the province. You can actually have your staff in a decentralized way. So I think that's also going to be very different. And in the future, we might walk into these organizations and not recognize them, you know, as the think tanks of 2021. But I am pretty sure they will be continuing to fulfill the functions of think tanks, you know, to inform policy based on knowledge, to inform debates, to prepare the next generation of decision makers, to create spaces for debate, for discussion, to bring the extremes to the middle, etc., etc. So what I would encourage us to think is, let's look at the effects that COVID has had in the short term, but not just to just leave it there, but to think, you know, what do these changes mean for think tanks in the very long term, you know, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. And I would encourage think tanks to start preparing for those changes, right? Start thinking about how we're going to bring that diverse workforce. How are we going to really engage with these different audiences? And what are the implications on our business models? Because I think there are many for sure. And I want to finish with that and thank everybody for the invitation and for the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Enrique. Drawing from the short-run implications to the lessons for the long-run implications, it was really excellent. And one thing that is emerging from combined all this discussion, think tanks will be changing and their role, function, scope, the way they work, the way they operate, and the way they do exist. Not brick and more cement offices, maybe very boundaryless think tanks, increasing the options for collaborations. And so this brings us almost to the closure of the first round, a very excellent round of discussions. We will be just closing in 12 minutes. There are some comments in the chat box. If you want to pick on any of those comments, please, you can, but don't pick more than one point. But I would particularly like your thoughts, concluding thoughts on the way forward, particularly. The one thing that is emerging is that a broad-based partnership is essential to kind of in the future for the think tanks. And there are now new actors, the stakeholders in that partnership. It is going beyond the think tanks, the government. It is having now four to five layers that we need to work on: think tanks to think tanks, think tanks to new influencers. And again, we have a divide of influencer. Is it the celebrity influencer, or it is the individual who by virtue of his expertise is now affecting the policy? And particularly at the center is a stakeholder which actually was there in the background, that is the public at large, that needs to be more integrated, and this can lead to more representative think tanks. What can be your key one or two recommendations to build that kind of broad-based multi-layer partnership going forward for the think tanks? Thank you.
So can I come in?
Yes, let's start with that.
Because I have to leave. I wanted to just quickly come in on this last part before I disappear. And my apologies. My clock tells me that I have to be somewhere else. But no. So I think Enrique's presentation was fascinating. And it reminded me of the last paper I wrote for Jim in his compilation, where he had asked me to write on the future of think tanks. This was before the pandemic, Enrique. Everything you said was something, much of it was mentioned in that paper of mine prior to the pandemic. So in fact, the gig model of think tanks, the crowdfunding and crowdsourcing of financial support from multiple different kinds of avenues is something that is already underway. And you see many think tanks in India and other parts of the world that have really changed the way they operate. They are virtually an institution, geographically dispersed. They meet on the website as an institution, or rather on their on the app that they have created, or on the digital infrastructure. So I think Enrique, your presentation is spot on, and I think all of us need to start thinking about it. The issue that I want to actually flag is very interesting. Now, not for a moment am I suggesting research does not have to change. In fact, I think research has to dramatically alter, Enrique. It has to dramatically alter. I think it is still very Brahmanical in its approach. For example, if you look at the new movement in many parts of the world, including in Europe, where I'm speaking from today, we see lots of people engage with something called stories from below, experiences from below. Now, experiences from below was never considered a purist methodology for conducting research. Lived experiences of people were not given the same weight as some other form of evaluation. And I think we will have to become far more flexible in widening the net to bring in a wider set of inputs for any policy recommendations that impact a large number of people. So I think you are absolutely right. We will have to innovate with methodologies themselves. And I think that is what I call that we have to look at it like an art form. We have to invest in the art form. We have to improve the methodology. We have to widen the way of collecting scientific and policy knowledge. So again, your point well taken, and I think it's already happening. Institutions are beginning to include other methods than the purists would have liked us to in the past. And think tanks, since they are not academic, have the luxury of this experimentation. We are not wedded to a peer-reviewed journal or a professor's appreciation. Our job is to the public at large, and that is, I think, the art of research that we should invest into. And finally, I think if we were to look ahead, and someone asked this question on the chat, Worldometer and the various trackers that have come in, are these those institutions? My short answer would be no. Worldometer is a collaborative platform. It is not an institution. It is institution has certain other characteristics that a web platform simply does not offer. But yes, I see think tanks increasingly becoming part of consortiums that will create these exotic products outside the institution. So you could, like, for example, we have a COVID tracker, which has 4 different institutional partners working together to map India's various districts and their and the impact of the virus there. We will see nifty, nimble partnerships emerge. Everything is not an institution. Everything doesn't need to be an institution if it serves the purpose of being a very important policy tool. So we have to differentiate between an institution and a policy tool. I'll leave it there. But I really enjoyed all of your presentations. I learned a lot, and maybe we'll implement some of it in the days ahead at home as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Samir. Thank you. Dr. Vaqar? It'll be great if you can sum up in 2 minutes, please, because we can have other interventions as well. Do we have Dr. Vaqar with us? Okay. Dr. Andrea, can you way forward, please, just.
Thank you, Sajid. Well, I think that to move forward, I think that some things that we haven't discussed yet are these issues more. When you're saying like, how do we make this more collaborative and a network approach and a more engaging approach? I think one thing is that we need to be very generous as organizations, very generous with our knowledge, very generous with our experts, very flexible with the ways we do partnerships. I think this will be key. I think that think tanks, that have this capacity will succeed in the future. And this relates also to Enrique's previous comment of representation and diversity. I think in the future we will see many diverse faces taking a role in think tanks, and we saw this in as Enrique mentioned in our Young Think Tankers Forum, that we will have a next generation of very diverse individuals running think tanks. So I think it's important not to forget this other side of the coin, that we're not only here about the evidence, we're here about the change, and the change has to do with this other side of being a human being, of being generous with our knowledge, of being able to have a dialogue, of opening up ourselves to the ideas that others bring forward. And this is something that maybe many don't relate to the work of think tanks, but I think it's essential, and seeing it across many think tanks, I think that it's a very important quality.
Thank you, Andrea, and bringing on the generosity with the knowledge. And I think as I started with the recent kind of the generosity of scientific community, they have been publishing, and they were putting their papers uploaded on the websites before publications. They were giving the advanced copies. Definitely they have lost many citations, but this was exactly the generosity with the knowledge. And I think think tanks have a great things to learn from that experience. Let me go back to Enrique. For the proposals or the kind of the future that you see for the think tank, what are 2 to 3 things that needs to be done to move towards that future?
Thank you. I think one thing is that think tanks need to take it seriously. So they need to seriously think if their current business models, even if successful today, will be successful in the long run, right? That is, if think tanks want to exist in the very long run, and I think most of them want to. The second one, I think, is that they have to turn to the new generations, to the younger staff, not just researchers, younger communicators, researchers, managers, and give them a bigger space, bigger voice within the organizations to help shape that future. 10 years from now, the lead researchers are going to be the 26-year-olds, right, in the organization, right, the ones recently graduating from a master's, who probably right now in most think tanks do not have a leadership position, but I think they should be given the chance to shape those organizations. And the third thing, of course, is that they should reach out quickly to those audiences, and those stakeholders, those other actors that they usually do not work with, not necessarily to influence them now, but to learn about them, to know who they are, right? To really understand, what makes them tick, what motivates them, what sources of information they prefer, how they prefer to access information, etc. And I think that the question about the world of our world in data and the world of meter, it's an interesting question because as Dr. Samir said, I do not. This is not a think tank. Like many organizations often presented as think tanks or not think tanks. But what this suggests is that think tanks compete not just with other think tanks or with universities. In fact, they often compete with organizations that have nothing to do with what they do or are disconnected or tenuously connected. They often compete with other sources of intellectual entertainment, with public, with magazines and opinion piece sections in journals and in newspapers, television, as I said, streaming services, and other kinds of intellectual entertainment. And so they should not just look at other think tanks when they're thinking about the challenges they face or the competition they face.
Thank you, Enrique. Before we close, I'll just read you a message from Dr. Vaqar. He can hear us, but he cannot speak. We cannot hear him. Basically, maybe he's having some technical issues. And this brings us to the closure of this session. A very excellent discussion. And you can see from the chat, actually, much appreciation from the panel for the panelists, from the audience. And I would also like to thank on behalf of SDPI for joining us and sharing your thoughts. If we can summarize in one term, one sentence, and I think the COVID has brought environment in a Darwinian terms, the survival of the fittest. And this is where the think tanks need to prepare them for the future, learning from the past and expanding their vision and the toolkit that they operate with. I once again thank you so much for everyone from the audience and for the panelists. Thank you so very much. Have a good day, a very good evening.